Welcome everyone to CivilNet. Today I'm joined by Schug, co-founder of Rerooted, a project that collects and preserves the testimonies of Armenian diaspora communities around the world and advocates for accountability, recognition, and justice. Ani, thank you very much for stopping by.
Thanks so much, Mark, for having me. We're so excited.
So since you and your co-founder, Anush Bagdasaryan, started the project 6 years ago, Rerooted has grown to become one of the biggest online collections of testimonies, photos, and documents from Syria's Armenian community. I understand you and your team are now expanding your focus to Nagorno-Karabakh. What else can you tell us about that, and what lessons are you taking from working with Syria's Armenians to Nagorno-Karabakh's Armenians?
Nice. Awesome. Thanks for giving us our background and kind of segueing perfectly to talk about where we're going next with our project. So we started in 2017. We saw with the effects and the ongoing war in Syria that Armenians were being affected in terms of like direct harms against them in the war, and then also in terms of destruction to the community. There was 100,000 Armenians and only 20,000 about left. And so we wanted to collect their stories to preserve a snapshot of the beautiful community that existed in Syria. So my textbooks were always printed in Syria. There was so much rich Western Armenian culture there. So we wanted to preserve all of those aspects, and then also for justice and advocacy reasons, document what had happened to the community during the war to make sure those voices were brought to the international community working in the Syrian context. So we've collected about 250 interviews thus far, and really what we were not expecting is how much work there is on the back end to get them on our website and get them translated and transcribed so people can use them. So now if you visit our website, rerooted.org, what we really strive for is accessibility of the interviews, and everyone who shares their story knows that it's going to a public archive so that other people can learn about their stories, their past, what they want for the future. So now, in the last 2 years or so, we've been expanding to different communities around the world because we've kind of gotten our process down and we want to share that with other communities. So we've gone to Argentina, we've done a few smaller sets of interviews with people from France, Russia, Egypt, Iran, sort of all over. But as you mentioned, our big focus right now is both Artsakh Armenians and then also Armenians who were survivors of the pogroms in the Azerbaijan SSR. And so I think some of the biggest lessons we learned is, one, how to use the interviews after we have them. So we don't want to just have the interviews sit like somewhere and not be used. So the first part of that is how to transcribe them, translate them, put them on the website. And so we have sort of a whole internal system we finally worked out to have that process move forward. And an exciting thing is that our limited funding goes directly to people from the community who do the transcription and translation. So we've built a good team of people who do that and expanding now with our new collection. And then the second part of making them useful and accessible is what resources we build out from them. So for Syria, we have an interactive map of different cultural heritage sites in Syria, whether they've been destroyed, if they're being rebuilt in the Armenian community. We have lesson plans, we have ways to use it to learn Western Armenian, ways to preserve Western Armenian. And tons of justice reports to the UN that are just sort of general, and also general advocacy reports. So we want to bring all those resources and internal systems to the Artsakh collection and even do more, because it's so urgent right now to be collecting and doing something with these stories, because as of right now, there's no one left in the community.
Well, I'm glad that you brought that up, because I understand that a particular focus of Rerooted's work with Nagorno-Karabakh's Armenians is documenting alleged atrocities and war crimes. Of course, these are not easy conversations to have, to say the least. Can you tell us more about that aspect of your work and what you plan to do with those testimonies?
Yeah, for sure. So first I want to mention too that we've partnered with All for Armenia for this collection, which has been great in terms of having a partner on the ground who's like very familiar with communities that have been here since 2020 and also just arrived. And it's really great to have a counterpart in Armenia that's sort of supporting people in other ways besides the testimonies, because testimony and long-term preservation is so important, but there's so many needs right now. So with our Syria collection, we benefited a lot from Aleppo NGO support and other local grassroots organizations. And so we're very excited to be working with All for Armenia. And in terms of what we're documenting is the harms and atrocities of the last 3 years, the first part I would say is that we have a very open type of oral history interview that we do. So especially when we planned this trip, the events of September had not yet happened. So for some people, it's extremely, extremely fresh. And we never pressure anyone if they're not ready to tell their stories, if they just want to talk about the beautiful parts of Artsakh, what they loved about being there, their family's long history, we can focus on that. But we found, we never pressure anyone, but we found a lot of people are ready to speak. And so Anush, my co-founder, who is a lawyer, she, right after, like early October, she had done a lot of not oral history style, but legal interviews to get sort of more concrete facts. And she's using those to work on several different projects. So we have 3 partnerships, 2 with clinics at Harvard Law School, where Anush graduated from, and then 1 at Leiden University. And so those students are working on a variety of topics. So it's using the information we have to write both a public-facing report and then a report that will be sent to the ICC to document what happened in Armenia and sort of explain under international law what crimes were committed and what possible ways for, as you mentioned, like acknowledgement or recognition, justice for these crimes can be found.
That's wonderful. And of course, after the collapse of Nagorno-Karabakh in September, the list of hardships facing the roughly 100,000 Armenians forcibly displaced from their homes just seems endless. Mm-hmm. Housing, clothing, schooling, food, work, physical and mental health care. What would you say to people who may argue it's more important for now to focus on responding to those more immediate needs? In your view, why is now the time to be documenting these testimonies? Yeah,
that's such an important question. And I think we're very careful to never try to overstep the work that's being done on the ground to provide for all those other needs. If it's not the right time for someone to tell their story because of psychological harms that they're dealing with, or just like not having, people want to first have a place to live and a place to eat. So we, always respect that first and really respect the organizations that are doing that work, and never try to paint to anyone that these testimonies will fix things immediately in the future. But we do believe that documenting these stories as close to when the events occurred is so important. That was sort of the motivation too behind the Syria collection, because these events were happening right now, and we didn't want to have that moment that so many of us feel about the genocide. So many Armenians feel about the genocide, where it's like, oh, I wish I had got my grandparents' story. I wish I had that written down. And once it's gone, the people might be gone, the stories might be forgotten. It's just gone. And so when we started with Syria, other communities even would come and say, I wish we had this during the Lebanese Civil War or during the US war in Iraq. Like that, obviously people will still remember those events, but it wasn't sort of as current to getting as much documentation and stories in that time. And so for Artsakh, most of those other communities where war happened or other conflicts, communities dwindled, but there are still people there. And so as of right now, there are no Armenians, almost practically no Armenians in Karabakh. And so being able to collect both the stories and also photos, videos, documents that people have from Karabakh, if they're not yet ready to tell their story, is so important. So that for justice purposes, we have the most accurate and recent reflections, memories of what happened. And for understanding Artsakh identity, we're able to start now building resources, whether it be a map or some sort of linguistic tool to preserve Artsakh Barbar, or teach. A lot of people have already said, I want my children, even if they keep living in Armenia, to know our dialect. So building different tools that will help the community moving forward, sort of more long-term, based on what they know and what they want to tell now.
So I know it's only been less than 2 months since the ethnic cleansing of Nagorno-Karabakh. So you haven't had a whole lot of time to be collecting these testimonies and everything. Looking forward, what can we expect from Rerooted, both public-facing and private-facing, or more on the international legal side, as you mentioned?
Yeah. So publicly, the publication of a lot more interviews. So if you go on our website, we do already have our Artsakh collection open, but it's not a lot yet. So hopefully, weekly, we're updating more interviews that you can use if you just want to, sort of hear a perspective of someone from Karabakh or Artsakh of what they've experienced, their views on things. And then once we have a bank of interviews, we start using those interviews to create the resources I mentioned. Because for us, preservation is how we can use the past to sort of create action, create something new. So once we have a good amount of testimonies that have been transcribed, translated, we can use those to create the resources I mentioned, linguistic, lesson plans, maps, maybe recreation of towns and churches. So all of that will be public facing, and we really want it to be the most useful for people working in a variety of fields related to this work. And then we also, from the legal side, will have a few resources that are public facing. So there'll be the advocacy report that the students from Leiden University are working on, which will be similar to what we're going to report to the ICC, but in a way that we can make public and educate the wider community, both legal and Armenian non-legal organizations. We're also, if you follow us on social media, going to be doing a lot more posts sort of explaining what's happening, like right now with the case in the ICJ, if there's future movement or changes with the ICC, sort of explaining to the wider community what that means, so that Armenians can respond and sort of act with more knowledge. So we're trying to do the education piece while we're also working on internal reports or things that we send to international bodies. That's great. Well, I'm sure that we'll all be keeping an eye. And Ani, thank you again for joining us. Yeah, thank you so much. This was great. Absolutely. And thank you for joining us on CivilNet.